The neighborhood was a tomb of silent secrets, but Leo couldn't ignore the way Mr. Henderson's house seemed to swallow the light every single evening.
Weeks of unanswered letters were stuffed into the metal mouth of the mailbox, a growing testament to a man who had simply ceased to exist one Tuesday. The architecture of the Henderson place felt distorted, as if the very wood and brick were mourning the loss of the soul that once inhabited them. Leo's hands trembled slightly as he sipped his cold coffee, his eyes locked onto the upper floor window where a curtain had twitched just a moment ago. There was no wind tonight, yet the fabric moved with a deliberate, slow grace that suggested something was standing right behind the thin, dusty veil. Driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't name, Leo stepped off his porch and moved toward the boundary that separated his life from the unknown. Through the narrow gap in the cedar planks, the neighbor's yard looked neglected, overgrown with weeds that clawed at the foundation like desperate green fingers. The back door stood slightly ajar, a black rectangle of absolute darkness that seemed to be exhaling a cold, metallic scent into the humid summer air. Then he heard it, a sound so thin and high it could have been a bird, except for the unmistakable cadence of a human voice begging for mercy. The crickets went silent all at once, leaving Leo alone with the echo of that scream, which vibrated deep within the marrow of his aching bones. Panic flared in his chest, but the voice sounded so much like Henderson that his sense of duty overrode the primal urge to run back inside. He stepped onto the forbidden soil, the dead leaves under his boots sounding like breaking bones in the oppressive stillness of the midnight hour. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself were a magnet, pulling him into its maw with an irresistible, malevolent force. The brass was freezing to the touch, despite the heat of the night, and a layer of grime coated his skin as he pushed the door wider.
The kitchen was a frozen moment of domestic chaos, with half-eaten meals rotting on the table and a swarm of flies dancing in the pale moonlight.
Leo noticed bare footprints tracked through the thick dust, leading away from the table and toward the basement door, which hummed with a strange energy. The stench of decay was thick here, a cloying sweetness that coated his throat and made him want to retch right there on the
Behind the basement door, something was rhythmic and wet, a steady thumping that matched the frantic beating of Leo's own terrified and racing heart.
He leaned his ear against the wood and heard a frantic whispering, thousands of words tumbling over each other in a desperate, nonsensical prayer for death. A sudden clawing sound from the other side made him jump, the sound of fingernails dragging across the wood as if trying to find a way out. The lock clicked with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine, and the door began to swing inward of its own accord, inviting him down. The stairs vanished into a bottomless black pit, the air rising from below smelling of wet earth and something much, much older than the house itself. The first step groaned under his weight, a high-pitched protest that seemed to echo through the entire skeleton of the abandoned and cursed building. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting a weak path through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that looked like tiny floating insects in the air. The walls were covered in strange markings, carved deep into the concrete, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when the light wasn't directly on them. Leo realized with horror that the markings were names, hundreds of them, and Mr. Henderson's name was the very last one at the bottom of the pile. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair, surrounded by a circle of salt that had been broken by something dragging itself toward the corner. His light flickered as it passed over a shadow that was darker than the rest, a shape that didn't move like a human or an animal. The screaming started again, but this time, it wasn't muffled. It was coming from everywhere, vibrating through the floor and the ceiling and Leo's teeth. The light landed on a figure huddled in the corner, its skin the color of damp parchment,
wearing the tattered remains of Mr. Henderson's favorite flannel shirt. It wasn't Mr. Henderson anymore. The proportions were wrong, the limbs too long, and the spine twisted into a shape that no living man could survive.
Leo whispered the man's name, his voice cracking with a terror so profound it felt like his soul was trying to leave his body through his throat.
The thing turned its head with a series of wet cracks, but where there should have been a face, there was only a smooth, featureless surface of skin. The screaming wasn't coming from a mouth. It was vibrating out of the creature's very pores, a symphony of agony that had no physical source. Suddenly, the shadows on the walls detached themselves, rising up like black ink in water, surrounding Leo in a circle of ancient and hungry darkness. His flashlight hit the ground and shattered, plunging the room into a strobe-like flicker that revealed the shadows getting closer with every beat of his heart. The darkness felt cold and oily as it touched his boots, a numbing sensation that began to climb up his legs like the grip of a drowning man. He tried to run, but his feet felt as though they were encased in lead, the basement floor turning into a thick, tar-like substance that held him fast. The stairs were changing, stretching and warping, until the exit looked miles away, a tiny square of light in a universe of absolute and eternal shadow. The faceless thing rose to its full, impossible height, its long fingers reaching out toward Leo's face with a gesture that was almost like a mocking caress. The air around the creature hummed with the sound of 1,000 dying screams, a frequency that made Leo's vision blur and his ears begin to bleed. He fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head as he tried to shut out the noise. But the screaming was inside his brain now, rooted and growing.
On the floor lay Henderson's watch, its glass cracked and its hands spinning wildly backward, as if time itself was being unmade in this cursed cellar.
Black fluid began to drip from the ceiling, landing on Leo's shoulders and burning like acid, marking him as the next soul to be claimed by the house. In a final burst of adrenaline-fueled terror, Leo surged upward, his fingers finding a loose brick in the wall and using it to propel himself towards the stairs. He climbed like a madman, his hands slipping on the wet wood, while the thing below let out a sound that was half laughter and half shriek. He looked back once and saw the creature scuttling up the underside of the stairs, its movements jerky and insect-like, closing the distance in seconds. He threw himself through the kitchen door and slammed it shut, throwing his entire weight against the wood as something heavy and wet crashed against the other side. His fingers fumbled with the bolt, clicking it into place just as the wood began to splinter under the force of the creature's frantic and powerful blows. He didn't stop to look back. He ran through the kitchen and out the back door, the hot night air feeling like a cold shower against his feverish and sweaty skin. He vaulted over the fence, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and didn't stop until he reached the safety of his own locked front door. Safe inside, he slumped against the door, the familiar smells of his own home doing nothing to soothe the icy terror that had taken root in his mind. The house was silent, but then he heard it, a faint, muffled scream, coming not from next door, but from the vents in his own living room floor. The sound was unmistakable, a rhythmic crying that matched the cadence of the thing in the basement, and it was moving through the pipes toward him. Leo backed away, his eyes fixed on the vent, as a thin trail of black liquid began to seep out from between the metal slats of the floor grate. His own walls began to show the same markings he had seen in the basement, the names of the lost, appearing in dark, wet stains on his pristine wallpaper. At the very bottom of the wall, his own name began to etch itself into the plaster, the letters smoking as if carved by an invisible, red-hot finger. The lights flickered and died, leaving him in a darkness so thick he could feel it pressing against his skin, cold and eager to consume him whole. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out, only the high-pitched, rhythmic vibration of Mr. Henderson's voice finally finding a new home. The neighborhood remained quiet, 2 houses now standing dark and empty, while the screaming continued, unheard by everyone except the shadows that lived within the walls.